The role of non-native learners in the development of national varieties of Portuguese. Portuguese is currently one of the 10 most spoken languages in the world. According to the Ethnologue rating for 2021, it is in ninth place with 258 million speakers. It is thus the third European language most spoken in the world, following Spanish and French. Portuguese is spoken as an official language in countries scattered over 4 continents, in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. This is the contemporary result of the historical expansion from Portugal to numerous other territories in other continents, initiated in the 15th century. Given this historical expansion, Portuguese, a language that originated in Europe out of Latin, is now spoken worldwide, presenting many different national varieties. For this reason, Portuguese is regarded as one of the pluricentric languages of the world. According to Baxter, 1992, a pluricentric language is one that presents different national varieties, even if reflecting different stages of standardization. So this is important. Not all current national varieties of Portuguese present a stable, standardized norm, acknowledged as such even by their own speakers. One of the reasons for this has to do with the fact that in many countries in which Portuguese is the official language, it is spoken as a non-native language by a significant part of the population. In fact, out of the 258 million speakers of Portuguese, it is estimated that between 170 million and 200 million speak this language as an L1. This is to say, as a mother tongue or a native language. Why? The remaining 88 to 58 million have learned it as a non-native language. There are also those who speak it as a heritage language. Portuguese is spoken as a native language by the majority of the population in Portugal and in Brazil, highlighted in blue, and as a non-native language by varying parts of the population in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé e Príncipe, East Timor, and Macau, highlighted in red. In the Asian territories in which it has an official status, it is only spoken by a small part of the population, while in the African countries in which it has official status, it is widely known and used. Those who speak Portuguese as a heritage language are also scattered throughout the world in different immigrant communities. However, today we will not refer to these cases in which Portuguese is a heritage language. We will rather concentrate on the contexts and the communities in which it has an official status and is spoken either as a native language or as a non-native language, a second language, by the members of such communities. In these settings, Portuguese presents both native and non-native varieties. In the first case, we refer to situations in which the language is acquired by children up to the age of 5 to 6 years. In the second case, Portuguese is acquired by late learners as a non-native language. Now, in any one of the countries in which Portuguese has official status, one can find speakers of both types. So even though Portuguese is the native language of the majority of the population in Portugal, there are, of course, speakers of Portuguese in Portugal who have acquired it as a non-native language. They represent a minority of cases, but they do exist. These non-native speakers are, however, immersed in a language environment that reinforces native input. So even if these non-native speakers have children, these children will be exposed to vast amounts of native input in the community to which they belong. Likewise, in countries where Portuguese is spoken mostly as a second or a non-native language, native speakers do exist, but these are exposed to a vast quantity of non-native input in their surrounding environment. This is the scenario that is most interesting to us today, given our goal, which is to demonstrate the extent to which the non-native acquisition by late learners of Portuguese has contributed to the formation of several national varieties of this language. As we will see, the influence of non-native learners has shaped emerging national varieties of Portuguese, especially in African countries, but also in the established national variety of Brazilian Portuguese. In fact, historically, Brazilian Portuguese was under the influence of vast numbers of non-native speakers of the language who have contributed to the dissemination of a set of very specific traits that differentiate Brazilian Portuguese from European Portuguese on one hand, but that tie a link between Brazilian Portuguese and the current non-native varieties of Portuguese on the other. We will now concentrate on the concept of non-native varieties. National non-native varieties develop in multilingual ex-colonial communities where the language of the former colonial power maintains a functional and more often also official status. In these communities, the non-native variety coexists with autochthonous national languages and also, in some cases, with Creoles. Creoles are, from a historical perspective, recently formed languages resulting from language contact, but it is not a topic that we will go into much further today. Non-native varieties are frequently looked upon both by their own speakers as by others as imperfect byproducts of the European varieties of that same language. Historically, a non-native variety starts off as a very unstable variety with transitory and highly variable linguistic features. Over time, a progressive stabilization of a number of these features occurs. Note that many of these features do not correspond perfectly to the equivalent structures of the European variety. This process of stabilization is accomplished through nativization, or more simply put, through the early acquisition of the non-native variety by children before the age of 5-6 years. So in this case, and in the perspective of these children, the language in question is no longer non-native, even if the input to which they are exposed and that fuels the acquisition process is non-native in nature. We will now move on to the consideration of properties that current non-native varieties of Portuguese exhibit and that are also relevant for Brazilian Portuguese. These properties pertain to three different types of linguistic structures: nominal agreement in number, subject-verb agreement and verb inflection, and argument structure of verbs. European Portuguese presents full number and gender agreement between the noun and all other elements of the noun phrase that co-occur with the noun. Each noun in Portuguese is marked for gender, masculine or feminine, and number, singular or plural. And each noun thus triggers gender and number agreement in the noun phrase. So in the case of the noun carro, car, which is masculine and singular, all other words in the noun phrase will also be masculine and singular. If carro is pluralized, this will reflect across the noun phrase, with all other words agreeing with the noun that will also present in their plural forms. Likewise, if the feminine and singular noun casa, house, is used in a noun phrase, all other words in the noun phrase will also be feminine and singular. When casa is pluralized, this also triggers pluralization across the noun phrase. This being said, we will now concentrate on number agreement in the noun phrase and leave gender agreement for another date. In many different non-native varieties of Portuguese, there is a well-documented tendency for not complying with nominal number agreement, or full nominal agreement. This first slide presents examples from Portuguese spoken in Mozambique and Angola as compared to European Portuguese. In these examples, it is very clear that while all elements in the noun phrase in European Portuguese are marked for number, in these non-native varieties of Portuguese, the tendency is to mark the plural on the specifier, a determiner, such as an article, a demonstrative, or a possessive, or a quantifier. But other patterns of noncompliance with full nominal agreement are also possible in these same varieties and can also be seen in other non-native varieties of Portuguese. Here we present data regarding nominal number agreement in East Timorese Portuguese compared to data regarding learners of European Portuguese as a foreign language who are native speakers of Spanish, German, and Chinese. In the box, we can see that the first example replicates the structural pattern already seen before. This is to say, the plural marking on the specifier. But the other three examples illustrate plural markings on the noun, in some cases also spreading out to other constituents. But what is worth noteworthy here is that while learners of Portuguese as a foreign language also produce non-target nominal number agreement in blue, speakers of East Timorese do so to a higher extent. In the case of both populations, gender agreement seems to be more problematic than number agreement, but as I said before, we will not discuss this today. Moving on to subject-verb agreement and verb inflection. In standard European Portuguese, there are 5 forms of each tense of the verb, reflecting person and number values triggered by the subject. In non-native African varieties of Portuguese, this paradigm is often reduced to 3 forms, presenting as such in the Portuguese spoken in Mozambique and in Angola, according to Gonçalves 2013. Other sources, such as Bacelar do Nascimento et al. In 2008, based on data extracted from the Corpus Africa available at the Center of Linguistics of Lisbon University, confirm this tendency in other non-native varieties of Portuguese, in Cape Verde and São Tomé e Príncipe. And Ciopa et al. In 2004 note that 48% of non-target structures produced by university students in Mozambique belong to the subject-verb agreement category. Again, if we compare data from learners of Portuguese as a foreign language with non-native East Timorese speakers of Portuguese, who are university students in this case, we can see that these tend, on average, to produce more non-target subject-verb agreement occurrences. Okay, moving on to argument structure now. Argument structure of verbs is another area in which non-native varieties differ significantly from European Portuguese. Argument structure refers to the categorical, functional, and semantic requirements of main verbs. Focusing now on the categorical and functional requirements of a verb such as dar, to give, one can note that in European Portuguese, this verb selects a noun phrase as a subject, another noun phrase as a direct object, and a prepositional phrase introduced by the preposition a case marker, as an indirect object. Differences regarding argument structure of verbs at the functional and categorical levels have been well documented in the literature on non-native varieties of Portuguese. Here are a few examples in which objects filled in with prepositional phrases in European Portuguese are filled in with noun phrases in non-native varieties. And these are examples in which the previous situation is inverted. This is to say, cases of verbs that in European Portuguese select noun phrases as direct objects, but that in non-native varieties select prepositional phrases as indirect objects or as oblique objects. Finally, we present some cases in which categorical and functional argument structure does not seem to differ much between national varieties on the surface, but in which a different preposition is selected by the same verb in these different varieties of Portuguese. Now we will move on to try to demonstrate the extent to which Brazilian Portuguese is an excellent example of a native variety in which many non-native structures persist, some of which have been institutionalized or standardized, thus contributing to the definition of a new, different norm. In order to understand how this is so, it is important to note that Brazilian Portuguese is a result of language contact. European Portuguese, its first and main ingredient, is not, as such, its only ingredient. European and Brazilian Portuguese currently differ not only because each of the varieties spoken in two different continents have drifted away from each other over time, but because in Brazil, European Portuguese entered during its early history into contact with other languages, and for a long time. To be more precise, in Brazil, numerous speakers of other languages of African or Native American origins became non-native learners of Portuguese, and these non-native learners were instrumental in making Brazilian Portuguese what it is today. Note that Portuguese from the mid-19th century onwards also entered in contact with other European and non-European languages because of immigration fluxes, but we will not refer to the influence of this historically more recent layer today. So, we will consider, for the purposes of today's talk, three main elements in the formation of Brazilian Portuguese, with its different varieties. The Portuguese element, the African element, and the Native American autochthonous element. So let's start with the Portuguese element. Contrary to what happened in other former Portuguese colonies, such as those in Africa or East Timor, where the functional presence of Portuguese and the massive presence of Portuguese-speaking individuals only occurred very late in the second half of the 19th century, or even in the 20th century, actually. In Brazil, colonization started very early. Brazil was found or discovered by the Portuguese in 1500, and 50 years later, in the mid-16th century, the intense and steady colonization of Brazil had already begun. There are two important spikes in Portuguese colonization to note. One in the 18th century during the gold rush, and another one in the 19th century after the Portuguese royal family, fleeing from the French invasions in Portugal, settled in Rio de Janeiro, bringing with them 1,500 individuals, speakers of European Portuguese, and thus causing an impact on the local way of speaking the language. To consider the major impact that the African element had in shaping Brazilian Portuguese, it is important to note that the slave trade in Brazil started at the same time as colonization, more precisely in 1549, and it was regular and intense, officially only until 1830, but actually until after that date. In the mid-16th century, the population of African origin represented 42% of the general population in Brazil. These African slaves spoke 200 to 300 different languages, mainly of the Bantu family. Obviously, these individuals forcefully and brutally brought from Africa into slavery were mostly adults and were, as such, exposed to oral Portuguese as late learners of the language. Those who did housework were exposed to Portuguese more intensely on a day-to-day basis, but those who worked in the fields, the vast majority, were exposed to lesser quantities of this new language. To complete the equation we are writing out, we also need to add to the Portuguese and African elements the autochthonous element. This is to say the Native Americans who already inhabited Brazil when the Portuguese arrived in 1500 and who spoke the Tupi language of the Tupi-Guarani family. Tupi was the general language of Brazil and was actually protected as such by the Portuguese Jesuits, who proceeded to describe it and who used it in their attempts to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. So, given these circumstances, Tupi coexisted for a long time alongside Portuguese. This Portuguese-Tupi bilingualism was, however, seriously attacked in the 18th century when, in 1757, the Marquês de Pombal issued legislation specifically prohibiting the use of Tupi and making the use of Portuguese mandatory. Portuguese was thus made official, and Tupi was relegated into clandestine. Obviously, native speakers of Tupi were also, in the process, forced into learning Portuguese as a non-native language. So this brief historical explanation of the language contacts that went on for 5 centuries is important to understand the current sociolinguistic varieties of Brazilian Portuguese. One of the most striking features of current Brazilian Portuguese is the great disparity existing between what we may call grammar book Portuguese, that conventional teaching models make an effort to enforce, and Brazilian vernacular Portuguese, widely spoken in Brazil and displaying many features that do not converge with those sanctioned by grammar book Portuguese. The extent to which this is the case is captured in a well-known quote by Virginia Matos e Silva in 2004, stating that "O português são dois, Portuguese in Brazil are two, if not more than two," since these two varieties can actually be perceived as two extreme points of a continuum throughout which different sociolinguistic varieties can be distributed. Our argument today is that while grammar book Portuguese is, despite its specificity, quite close to European Portuguese, Brazilian vernacular Portuguese is not. We contend that Brazilian vernacular Portuguese has been shaped historically by features that are typically produced by non-native learners of this language and that, as such, are common to other currently existing non-native varieties of Portuguese. To sustain this argument, let's go back to the structures we saw a little while ago as representative of current non-native varieties of Portuguese. What is noteworthy is the very strong affinity between certain characteristic structures of the current non-native varieties and those of Brazilian vernacular Portuguese. Some of these features are very stigmatized, such as the simplification of the verb inflection paradigms and its consequence as far as subject-verb agreement is concerned, and also non-standard noun-number agreement patterns. But other features have actually been incorporated into grammar book Portuguese. There are examples of this precisely in the case of verb argument structure, as we will see. So, as far as nominal number agreement is concerned, Portuguese vernacular Portuguese presents a pattern that is common in African non-native varieties, marking the plural on the specifier and leaving the noun unmarked. In what regards verb inflection paradigms and subject-verb agreement, Brazilian Portuguese presents different patterns that contrast with European Portuguese, where 5 verbal forms exist. Brazilian Portuguese, depending on the sociolinguistic variety in question, presents systems consisting in 4 forms, 3 forms, or even 2 forms. The 4-form paradigm is standard, the 3 forms paradigm is widespread and well tolerated, and the 2 forms paradigm is also common, yet stigmatized. Non-stigmatized and perfectly standardized are certain verb argument structures that are different from European Portuguese. To conclude, Brazilian vernacular Portuguese, currently a native variety of Portuguese, has its roots in non-native varieties. Brazilian vernacular Portuguese and current non-native varieties present common trends in different grammatical domains. Non-native learners of Portuguese have played and are still playing a very relevant role in defining national varieties of Portuguese as the pluricentric language that it is. Obrigada.